and I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Lutz Kleveman, who's going to speak to us about the migration crisis from a journalistic point of view. Lutz is an investigative journalist and a photographer who is currently exploring the migration crisis in Europe, but previously he wrote many articles about energy interests, geopolitics, and the US foreign policy. And he has been to several of the most dangerous places in Europe because he has been reporting about the end of the war in Yugoslavia, about blood diamonds in Africa, about Afghan warlords and the Iraq War, and he even visited North Korea for a week. And he has some truly amazing photos and stories to share with you, both now live and on his Facebook and homepage. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lutz. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great honor, actually, to be here in this venerable institution, one of the oldest universities in Europe, and speaking to such a great and diverse audience coming from all over the continent, I suspect. Let's not lose any time at all. Can you not hear me well? Okay, technicians. Is this any better? Okay, fantastic. Let me just say a few words why I'm up here. For no other reason, I suppose, other than having worked as a reporter in war zones, conflict zones for about 10 years of my career, starting out in the Balkans in the late 90s, then covering various civil wars in West Africa, and then moving on to the Middle East and covering the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, working in Central Asia and other places for an English newspaper called the Daily Telegraph and Der Spiegel in Germany, and doing that for about 10 years of my life. And I do recall that covering refugees was one of the less popular jobs in the business. It was considered by editors back home as being a tedious and boring story. It was just misery, just civilians who had no influence on the events anyway, just suffering in miserable camps. I remember going to my first IDP camp, internally displaced people camp in Sierra Leone in 2001, I believe. And it was absolutely awful. 10, 20,000 people cramped into small space. But for the life of me, I could not sell that story in London. They just weren't interested in it. And over the course of the years, I realized partly why that is, because it is a lot easier, of course, to ignore a war if you can ignore the victims. If you can focus only on the battle, on the battle scenes. We'll be doing a question and answers. Yeah, can we turn this up even more? I mean, so you really have trouble hearing me there? Okay, this any better? Anyone who can't hear me, lift your arms there, or maybe come a little closer. Okay, I'll try and shout at the top of my lungs here. Try to get the message across. What I was saying earlier is that if you ignore the victims, of course, it's a lot easier to ignore the war as a whole. And the war in Syria that's been going on for 4 or 5 years now is a perfect example. No one's really wanted to hear about it in Europe or in America, even after that poison gas attack, you'll remember. Even after Obama's red line was crossed, people tried to forget about that war very quickly, and we did look the other way, most of us, for a number of years. I went to refugee camps in Lebanon. Now, most of the Syrian war refugees are, of course, in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And what I saw there was really quite awful in the Bekaa Valley. Again, thousands of people living in miserable conditions. But again, coming back home to Germany, to Europe, to England, there was very little interest in that. Oh, yeah, this is war, this is what happens. I called for donations for NGOs, helping these people. Again, there was a fair bit of indifference, I would say. And then what happened last year, as this indifference was spreading to governments, they cut down the funding to UNHCR, which is the UN agency looking after refugees. And the UNHCR then had to cut down their support for the refugee camps in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. And that's when people started moving. That was the last straw for many people who'd been living there out of danger, yes, but with no real perspective for their lives at all and their families. That's when they started moving towards Europe. And I have to say, apart from all the problems this may have caused, 1 million people migrating unchecked, uncontrolled, all across Europe into Germany, for all these problems, what I liked about the refugee crisis was that for the first time, these people brought the Syrian war to Europe. It put Syria on the agenda. They were voting with their feet. They were literally confronting us with the war, and our governments had to suddenly deal with that war, which for a long time they've been quite happy to ignore. Now, that is important because now all of a sudden the government said, oh, with all these migrants coming to Europe, we've got to do something. We've got to go to the root cause of this problem. We've got to deal with the war in Syria, after all. And that I found, for a beautiful moment at least, a very good thing. This mass influx of people doing away with the illusion that we can somehow afford to ignore these armed conflicts on Europe's periphery. The Middle East isn't that far away, but for a long time we were quite able to sustain that illusion that it was in a faraway country, North Africa, Middle East, and we didn't really have to worry about it, but now we did. And now for the first time in September, October last year, people walked across borders. What had been true for the internet, what had been true for communication, what had been true for free trade for years, which we've taken for granted, and I know many of you support these ideas, all of a sudden became true for people. People we'd been able to be friends with on Facebook for years, but who'd never been able to get a visa to come to Europe, now all of a sudden walked across Europe. And I thought that was a beautiful thing. Now, of course, things have changed. It's been 6 months only, and partly because very few countries, apart from Germany and Sweden, have been willing to actually accommodate refugees. The UK graciously and generously declared they would take 20,000 over the course of 5 years. Now, Germany has taken more than 1 million over the course of 4 months. But also in Germany too, the support has waned. There has been a backlash against this. So even Merkel now has to... There has been a turnabout, let's say, in her policy. I think it's going to be more pronounced in the coming weeks. Mostly because the Visegrad countries, led by Vienna, created facts by closing the borders and the Balkan routes unilaterally. Now, that sounds better, doesn't it? Now, if you've missed everything before, don't worry about it. I'm just getting into it now. Basically, what I was saying, refugee crisis was a good thing. And now what's been happening is that Greece, of course, is unwilling or incapable of controlling its external borders. Lots of islands, of course, it is a difficult thing. The new external border of Europe and the EU has basically moved up to the north of Greece. It's the Greek-Macedonian border now. And this is what it looks like. It is a double fence. Actually reminds me a little bit, I'm old enough to remember the old GDR border separating East and West Germany. If you put a few towers there and a few minefields, it wouldn't be any different, really. Of course, then the idea was to keep people in, and this is the idea here is to keep people out. But this is the new reality. There's NATO razor wire fence all along that border, produced in Hungary, by the way. And then, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, I think you'll remember, there were these news images of border guards, and it's not just Macedonians, it's also Austrians, Croats, Hungarians, they've all joined there to protect that border. They started firing tear gas at refugees. Now, a group of them were trying to get through the fence, and they had tear gas fired at them. And that's when it sort of clicked up here. Those who've followed me over the past 6 months know that I was skeptical about some aspects of letting all these refugees in. But just when they fired tear gas, I realized there was something going wrong here, and I was wondering just how long it would take for them to fire live ammunition at some point. So I booked a flight down to Thessaloniki and went to that spot where they fired tear gas, the Idomeni refugee camp on the border. And I'm going to show you a few slides and perhaps say a few words about them. Well, this is a familiar sight. This is people moving towards that camp on the highways of Greece. This is a fine young lady I met, 26-year-old Nadris Manzour. She's from Aleppo. Her husband went to Germany in September, and she spent the winter in Syria, in the war zone, along with her child, 2.5-year-old Basil. And they've been trying to fend for themselves, and now she's trying to join her husband in Germany. Well, Germany has actually made that more difficult for families to reunite. She's been on the road for nearly 4 weeks. The usual story, paying €1,000 to traffickers, getting on a boat. She doesn't know how to swim, he doesn't know how to swim. It was, she said it was 3 hours of nightmare, hoping they would get across to Greece, and that's where they are now, but they are stuck. They're having the door slammed in their faces, basically. This is what Idomeni looks like, and bear in mind, these pictures were taken on Monday and Tuesday when the weather was still quite nice and springtime-like. It then started raining, and some of you may have seen the pictures of the past few days. This place has turned into a mud hole, basically. Really torrential rain, and most people are sleeping in private tents like this. They have fires burning, and that's actually the first thing that hits you when you get to that camp. There's 14,000 people staying there at the time, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. There's bonfires, there's rotting garbage. Yes, you do smell urine. It's just getting worse every day. I spent 3 days there, and I have to tell you, in my 10 years, and I've seen a fair bit. I've never seen anything quite like that. These people live in utterly degrading and inhumane conditions. These are the tracks guarded by Greek police in this case to prevent another attempt at a breakthrough. Yeah, help us. Open the borders. Exhaustion after a long journey. That lady, I'm sure she had other plans for her old age than being moved around. The entrance of a larger tent. And that's Idris Mansour again and her little boy. She found a berth to sleep on. Actually, and this may come as a surprise to you if you follow mainstream media, most people in that camp are not young men trying to get to Europe. The majority of the people are women and children. When I was there were about 8,000 women and children. Many of them trying to join their husbands who are already in Germany and Sweden. And they're having a hard time. I mean, many of you can imagine, they're vulnerable. You know, it's hard to bring up a child even when you're in a properly heated and clean house. Now imagine looking after your child when you live under such circumstances. And Idris was lucky. She got a bed in a proper big tent. That's another Syrian mother from Aleppo. Now this is just 10 seconds to sing the praise of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. They are doing absolutely wonderful work. This is an NGO I've seen over the years doing incredible work. They had a hospital bombed recently in Kabul. They had a hospital bombed in Aleppo by the Americans and by the Russians. For that reason alone, if ever you think you have a bit of spare cash and you want to donate, you can't go wrong with these people. They're doing incredible work there. If it wasn't for them, the Greek state is not around. There are a few policemen, but if it wasn't for these NGOs, a few other private NGOs and Greek volunteers in this case, people would suffer a lot more. And actually, I wouldn't be surprised if some people had died already if it wasn't for these NGOs. These are lovely people, students from Germany. They bought an old military kitchen there, a mobile kitchen, and drove down across the Balkans, and they're making 130 liters of hot tea every day. Much in demand, let me tell you. Mobile toilet units, difficult to sustain hygiene, but people try. You know, life goes on. They have their hair cut, and they try to get mobile phones, the SIM card, so they can communicate with others on the road, with people back home, with people already in Europe. This is absolutely essential. There are no showers in the camp, obviously. But there's love, there are couples thinking about what to do next, I would imagine, in this case. A lovely young couple there. They were so in love, I didn't even want to speak to them. And then funnily enough, next to the camp, there was this green field, children running around. You can't help wondering, where can they go? And then you get closer to the fence, and things start getting a little messier there. This is actually the fence we saw at the beginning, and people pitched their tents right up to it, actually using the NATO wire to dry their clothes. And it's a sight that you will only see, I promise you, now. You will never see it again. The governments are going to make sure there will be no such photo op of that fence and the refugees together. So this is why it was important to go down there now and report it now, because this is what you get to see. There will be a sanitary cordon, they will call it, in the future. I'm absolutely sure about this. These are not pretty pictures. These are the chaps on the other side, not regular border guards, but actually special forces. I know special forces when I see them. They had APCs with mounted machine guns. You wonder why. Well, what are they going to use it against? The Austrian army, to its everlasting honor and credit, moved a military unit to that border that has lots of experience, as the Austrian media put it, in the crushing of popular uprising, in der Niederschlagung von Volksaufständen. Actually, thinking about it, I can't really remember the Austrian army crushing any popular uprisings after 1848, but anyway. So yeah, these are the people guarding that border, and they're heavily armed. And that's the people on the other side of the border, and they're not heavily armed. They're waiting to get across. At that time, they still let through 50, 100 people, mostly Syrians and Iraqis. But only if you were from unsafe cities. If you were from Aleppo, certain parts of Aleppo, the Macedonian border guards would say, oh no, you're from a safe part of the country, we won't let you through. So it was getting really random and arbitrary. And now the border has been closed completely. That's again Idris Mansour after her kid and his friends got some new clothes, and you know, she's trying to retain hope. This is a child's drawing, which I thought was worth photographing. This is how this particular child sees the situation at the camp, with lots of people on this side and fewer people on the other side. You know, it's the kind of fence, you know this expression in English, to stay on the fence when you're undecided about an issue and you don't want to come down on either side. It's a kind of fence, NATO wire, razor wire. Let me put it this way, it's difficult. It's difficult to stay on the fence, on a fence like that. And I really, for myself, I wondered which side of the fence I would rather be on. And then the rain started, and things were getting even messier. And it was getting incredibly cold again. I'll just leave it at that, because I do want a few of your questions. This is the last slide. I guess the situation's come across. I think the upshot of it all is, what do we learn from this when we see this? What are the conclusions, perhaps even the political conclusions? You know, whatever you may think about open borders, closed borders, some of us might actually feel relieved that the Balkan route has been closed, and there may actually be some justification politically for this turnaround and the closing of the borders. But you know, for a writer and for any one of us, there's politics and there's people. There's fellow human beings. You know, and it's their suffering that hurts us too. And we should not and we cannot. We cannot afford to look the other way again. It's not going to happen. Because we should bear in mind why people started moving last year. It was because the situation was becoming unbearable in the refugee camps, and it was becoming unbearable in the war zone. So the conclusion we have to draw from that is that if we close our borders, fine, close our borders. But we need to improve at least the situation, the living conditions in these refugee camps in Greece, in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon. The European governments need to spend a lot of money, whatever it costs, to improve the living conditions in those camps. And ultimately, of course, we need to start helping refugees before they become refugees. We need to do everything we can to stop these wars. Because we can no longer keep them at an arm's distance. We are together with these people. These people are us. We are these people. There's no separation there. We can keep them on that side of the fence for a few months maybe. But if we don't stop the root cause of their migration, then we haven't learned a thing. For more on this, other pictures, check out my website, check out my Facebook page, writer lutzkleveman.com. I wrote a little op-ed, a little essay on this, which you might want to check out and share with people, so the message doesn't get lost. And now we should perhaps have a few questions and have a bit of a discussion. Yeah.